Hey everybody, it's Bust. We're here in spoiler season for Legends of Runeterra. Today we'll be talking about the new keyword mechanic in Gloom and the new champion in Vex. And so, if you've caught the previous video where we talked about boost and spirit, you should be very understanding of what Gloom does. Looking at the spirit mechanic, it gives a unit +1/+1. Looking at the Gloom mechanic, it gives a unit -1/-1. And to me, it's very easy to evaluate spirit, right? It's not challenging to understand. Putting +1/+1 on my unit is good. I probably want to continue to put as many +1/+1s on them as I can. But on the flip side, if you're evaluating removal spells, it can be a little bit different, right? It's easy to say, okay, Vengeance is straightforward. I understand what it does. It just outright kills the unit and you're done. And then if you're looking at a board of say 1/1s, it's very easy to see where Gloom can be good, right? Your opponent has 5 2/1s on the board. They're playing pirates or something, and you play Existential Dread. You kill off most of them, and then they have one weakened unit left over. And so, like, is that good? Because you get yourself in this kind of mindset as to where, well, I cast Gloom, it negatively affected some opposing units. I was hoping to kill them, but they didn't die. That feels kind of bad. And that's, a tough mindset to really come in and break. And that's what I'm trying to do as I analyze some of these Gloom cards. And so as we look at a card like Glare, you grant a unit Gloom to draw 1. This is right kind of in that space of, say, Vile Feast, to where Vile Feast drains damage from a unit, and then you get a spider at the end of the day. But how much better or how much worse is it to deal 1 damage to a unit as opposed to attaching a Gloom to it? I mean, you are typically using that Vile Feast to just outright kill off a 1 health unit. And so if that's going to be the case, like, how do we feel about Gloom? Like, well, Gloom gets much better on the larger scale units since you can turn a 3/3 into a 2/2, to where if you cast a Vile Feast onto a 3/3, it essentially becomes a 3/2. It still has that extra point of attack, and the Gloom ability feels much better there. And so at the end of the day, I think the Gloom mechanic is probably going to be fine. It's going to depend a lot on the execution of the cards that we get to see. A card like Existential Dread that you have on your screen here, you grant all enemies Gloom. I feel like that's the kind of card to where we're going to get it in our head and get it in our mindset that we're expecting this to just kill all of the opposing units, but it probably doesn't need to be that good, right? If we're saying, okay, well, I play Eradicate frequently, Eradicate does come in and kill off the majority of the opposing units, are we willing to pay 1 less mana for an Existential Dread to kill off most of them, but weaken the ones that remain to where the Eradicate would not have taken them down? And so, it's going to be tough to tell. It's always very meta dependent, right? If the deck like Pirates is extremely good, then a card like Existential Dread is going to be good. Cards like Eradicate are going to be extremely good. But if we're in a meta to where, say, Pantheon is very good, to where you're just focusing in on one singular big unit, then cards like Existential Dread are not going to be that great. But on that same vein, cards like Glare could be good in a very Pantheon heavy environment, right? If your removal spells tend to not do anything to the opposing unit, casting a Vile Feast onto Pantheon doesn't really do that much. Being able to put Glare onto Pantheon and then grind him down a little bit and a little bit, a little bit over time with the boost mechanics and additional Glooms does give you removal in the space to where it may not have been useful in the past. And so, again, it's really tough to kind of hone in and analyze on how good this is or is not going to be. In the grand scheme of things, removal is always good. And removal that has additional value in the sense of Gloom potentially sticking around, or Gloom being useful on a unit that a removal spell traditionally just wouldn't kill, does give it a lot of staying power. And so I'm very interested in this. I think it should be stronger than it initially seems, right? Once we get out of our heads that casting a removal on a unit and not immediately killing it isn't the worst scenario, then I think we'll start to see Gloom as a lot better. And so, removal's always good. You guys played Booster Draft in your life. What's the first card you take out of every pack? Obnoxious Mythic card. What's the second card you take out? Removal spell. What's the third card you take? Removal spell. What's the fourth card you take? Removal spell. And what's the fifth card you take? Removal spell. You nailed it. And so if you're able to get back into that mindset, then I think Gloom looks to be like a very strong and powerful ability. So with Gloom in mind, we can bring that over to Vex. Vex is an interesting champion to me. I have no idea what Vex was from the space of Legends of Runeterra, or sorry, from League of Legends. I didn't play actual League when Vex existed. Vex came about to me through Teamfight Tactics, and I never knew what he was really about other than just being some kind of mage, right? He casts a lot of darkness style fireballs in Legends of Runeterra, I believe, and he's always some kind of scaling mage. And so I was curious to see how he panned out here, where I'm able to get a little bit more of that lore from Vex within this game. And I guess he needs to, first and foremost, he needs to get a shirt that fits. That's probably what he's so gloomy about, right? He's got his elf ears hat, but he doesn't have a shirt that fits. Seems like a tough life to live. Playstyle, defensive.
I should have stayed in bed.
So negative, so grumpy.
Oh, so positive. It's suffocating.
I'll handle this.
You just don't get it. I'll make your midnight dreary. At last.
No nightmare is too dark.
Wow, that was
So edgy.
lame.
So edgy. All right, let's get these attacks in. The cards are about to pop up.
How are the
Let's see what we have to say about those.
looking now?
Oh, pause. There we go. And so, okay, Vex, if you weren't able to catch that from the screens as they progressed along, this is a Bandle City champion / Shadow Isles champion carrying the Yordle tag. A 5/4 attack line from 4 cost isn't anything too special. Then it's also fearsome, and then on attack, you grant the strongest enemy unit Gloom. And so that's a lot of kind of keywords all within one card. To me, the problem that we'll see with Vex as opposed to the highlights with Vex are kind of twofold. Number one, it is a big collection of synergies that don't really work that well together to me, at least in the way I look at a lot of these. Whenever we're looking at Yordles typically want to be like smaller, go wide, attacky kind of things, right? You're really looking to get like a 1-drop on board on 1, a 2-drop on 2, and then on turn 3, maybe you play Bandle City Mayor, and then another 1-drop, and then on turn 4, you play Poppy, or turn 4, you play another really attack-oriented style of unit. And that's not exactly what you get out of Vex. That's not the play pattern that we're used to. And so if that's, number one thing that Vex isn't capable of doing, that's fine. It's just going to depend on how much supporting cast is out there otherwise. And so it's not to say that whatever Vex is trying to do is bad. It's just that given the context of the cards that we already have access to, he does not interact with those well. The other kind of piece of that is Shadow Isles is typically not a particularly good attacky style of faction, right? So Vex has this attack-based ability lined up with him. He's wanting to do a lot of attacking. Shadow Isles typically not too good at that. You do see some decks like Spiders from Elise. You do see some decks centered on Gwen. You do see some decks centered on Viego and the bigger Mistwraith style of things. And then there is the Fearsomes deck with Nocturne and such. But once you branch out from those like few specific instances, it's a faction that is notably not particularly good at attacking. And so it just worries me that, right from the start, looking at a champion like Vex, he doesn't fit into the existing Bandle City structure. His attack ability doesn't necessarily fit within the existing Shadow Isles structure. And so, again, it's not to say what he does is bad. It's just that he doesn't have a large collection of cards around him to help support these abilities that he's trying to do. Otherwise, I am very interested in what Vex is capable of. Me personally, over the course of the past year, the last year of opens that we had, I would say in at least 2 of them, maybe 3, we did play the Nocturne Fearsomes deck, which I was a huge fan of, and I always felt that was just like right on the brink of being good enough. And Vex is very interesting in that sense, right? A lot of the major plays that you're able to make out of Mistwraiths or to make out of a deck like the fearsome spiders that you occasionally see is having that way to shrink your opponent's attack. And that's what you do get from the Vex attack ability. And so when I think of what Vex is going to be able to do, to me, it really kind of ties into the idea of playing this within a Fearsome's deck. And so the big thing to making the Fearsome's deck active and work is having the density of Fearsomes around to make it actually worthwhile. And if that exists in Standard, then I think, Vex is kind of off to the races. If the Shurima one-cost Fearsome Grow on Slay thing is around, these should be best friends. If the 2-drop Spiders are still around, they would be friends. The 3-drop has things like Frenzied Skitterer. That works fantastically with the Fearsome's thing, and so I could definitely see Vex working out in that space. Looking up a little bit higher into his flip should be pretty easy to hit if Gloom is a thing that you're trying to do. And so if you say, okay, I've played Glare once, and then I've attacked with Vex once, that gets it halfway there. If I play a boost card, that might hit 2 Glooms, and you're essentially off to the races in terms of flipping Vex. I would say that if you really, really, really want to flip Vex with Gloom, you can do it on 4 occasionally, right? I would not be surprised if we played games to where when Vex attacks for the first time, he flips in the process, and then on turn 6, I would say that it's almost always going to be happening. And so just a very, very easy champion to pop this off with, especially if we're looking at the card from the preview to where you grant all enemies Gloom. That should be a fairly easy way to just pop your opponent for like 3 stacks of Gloom, and then you can attack with Vex for a 4th. And so I can definitely see these kind of grindy style of attack them down bonuses work. But again, if you are going after this kind of strategy, it needs to be attack focused, and that's what these champions and these factions are not particularly good at. And so I'll be very interested to see how that plays out. The last kind of consideration to me for Vex would be, we've really kind of tried to describe him in an attacky fashion. I don't know if that's just because that's the way that I view the game, that attacking is always the fun way to do everything, but do we ever want to, say, include Vex as a just kind of utility champion in Shadow Isles that provides some kind of mid-game style of attack value? Maybe. He could certainly fit something in like that. Or if we want to say like, okay, we're playing Viego today, so right, we're playing Viego Vex, and then we look to another faction for whatever those last remaining cards are. I could see him working in a deck like that as well, as to where we're not really counting on Vex to be the big like build around a backbone of the deck that we're trying to do, but it is still a reasonable like mid-game attack style of champion. He's got a decent stat line as a 9 stat 4-drop, and then this Gloom attack type of ability does tie into just weakening your opponent and making the removal spells better. So if you make your opponent's best unit a little bit worse, then you might be able to save your vengeance for the real good, strong, big unit that they play on the next turn. So very interested to see how that plays out. Again, I think he's probably more in that space of supporting role, right? So if we have big, true build-around champions like Gwen, right? I think, if you take Gwen out of a Gwen deck, the deck just fails. But I think if you take Vex out of the Vex deck, then it's probably still just looks like Fearsomes, or he looked like a utility unit, and he just felt like a good, strong card to play within that deck. And so I think that that's the place that he'll probably lie. As far as these other cards go, Glare is an important one to call out. I believe Glare is Vex's flip card, right? That's what it looks like it is on the screen. It doesn't say shuffle a copy of Vex into your deck, and so I'm not entirely certain there, but the important thing to call out with Glare is it is 2 things, actually. It's a common, so that means you can include it in your deck in deck building, and then it is also Bandle City plus Shadow Isles, and so it should apply to both factions, right? Should be able to play this in just your pure Bandle City deck. So you're out here playing your Bandle City Yordles deck, Vex nowhere to be seen within it. If you are wanting to include this kind of pseudo Vile Feast kind of 1 damage ping style of card within the deck, you're more than capable of doing that. It's also a card that should be generatable by Conchologist, and so very big value play coming out of the Conchologist to generate this pokey stick style of card that's capable of doing some kind of removal in the Gloom and then drawing a card while you're at it. The downside to Glare is it should get countered if the unit goes away. And so if you're thinking of Pokey Stick, you can deal 1 damage to an opposing unit, then you draw a card. And so if you deal 1 damage to an opposing unit, and then they grant Grim Feast, whatever destroy your unit, draw 2 cards thing is, you still draw the card at the end of the day. That will not be the case with Glare. So you cast Glare on your opponent's Green Glade duo, they recall it back to their hand, then you do not get the card draw. Very important to call out in terms of this thing being able to miss. Kind of in that space of miss as well. One of the things I'll be interested to see in is, kind of like strike effects with this stuff, as to where these should all be skill abilities, right? Vex's is an attack ability. It's going to put the negative onto the opponent's strongest unit. That does set up places to where you're wanting to get strikes, you're wanting to hit the opposing unit, but the unit dies before the strike happens. And so be interested to see if that kind of thing turns itself up, or in the Rico Rex style of all things, you just play these with overwhelms, right? You just grant gloom on the opposing unit, so your overwhelms come in and deal a little bit more damage. Excuse me, as far as these other cards go, Gloom Sprite seems kind of okay. Has a strike ability that grants impact. Impact is a boostable ability. Curious to see how this plays out. It's a very aggressively oriented card, but it doesn't have any keywords on it, so it's not a Yordle. Doesn't fit within that kind of space. I'm curious if this thing just being a 2/2 for 1 mana is good enough, as it does grow and get better with strikes. And so there can definitely be this kind of situation to where on turn 1, you play the Gloom Sprites and attack, it gets the point of impact, and then on turn 3, you play some kind of boost card and make the Gloom Sprites have 2 impact at that point, be able to move on from there. I think that it has a bit of potential, depending on how much we see boost running around throughout the course of Bandle City. Up next is the Grotesque Gift. It has Spirit on it, so it is technically a 2/2 for 2 mana. The first time an enemy unit is summoned, grant it Gloom. This is very powerful all in itself. This to me is sort of like being a 6-stat 2-drop, right? You typically get about 5 stats out of a 2-drop. With this, if you count it as being 4, and then your opponent's unit getting -2 as being another 2 stats into the Grotesque Gift, this is a very efficient unit. And so I would not be surprised to see this turning out and about. The things that will surprise me with this is if it finds a home in terms of the keywords again. And so if you're wanting to play the Grotesque Gift within a Vex deck, it does tie into that Gloom theme. But if we're moving this out elsewhere, if we're playing some kind of aggressive Vandal City deck, this doesn't have any like Yordle-based keywords. And it doesn't get any bonuses from that style of thing. So I always envision these things, the linear strategies that tend to come together with these early game aggro decks with like elites or Yordles and whatnot, tend to want a keyword on the card, or a subtype on the card, I guess I should say. This card does not have it. After that, the Family Reunion does seem quite strong in the context of Gloom Sprites, right? And so if you are able to be in this space to where, say, you're on the even attack tokens, you play Gloom Sprites on turn 1, then on turn 2, you play Family Reunion, you shrink your opponent's unit, that lets you attack with the Gloom Sprites. If you kill off the opposing unit in some kind of block on that shrunk unit, great, but we'll assume that the Gloom Sprites survive. On turn 3, you give your Gloom Sprites impact, and then on turn 4, you can boost your Gloom Sprites, and then the unit that you gave, you gave the -1 attack to. Now, is that like enough? Is this kind of stuff good enough to really pull off with this? Like, I'm not really convinced. Like, that does not sound like a particularly strong line to me, right? We play a 1-drop, we shrink our opponent's unit. On turn 3, we grow our unit with impact, and then on turn 4, we boost both of them. Now, the thing that is very interesting to me with Family Reunion is that you don't have to play all of these abilities back to back, turn after turn. And so we can say play Family Reunion on 2, shrink an opposing unit. Then we can say grant impact to a unit on turn 3. On turn 4, we don't have to boost anything. On turn 5, we don't have to boost anything. On turn 6, we don't have to boost anything. And so you can wait until a later point in the game to where you have stuff that really makes sense to want to target. And you don't have to just say like, oh, well, I spewed all these cards out early, I have to pay off on the Family Reunion right away. And so that's the kind of line, the kind of idea that really strikes me as these stories being better than we initially see. is to where you are able to like stop and wait and do things at your own pace. And so maybe you do play Gloom on a unit on turn 2, but then you wait until turn 4 to put impact on Sivir, right? And then on turn 6 you play boost on Sivir and then on another attacky based unit that you have. And so you now have the opportunity to target better things and use the level up abilities at kind of your own pace. And so that's what I think we'll see out of a card like Family Reunion. I'm not certain that Family Reunion is the one to really, go big with this, but this is a lot of targeting, right? If we're wanting to think in terms of, say, Morgana, right? This gives us 4 targets off of one singular card. And so I could definitely see a lot of power in cards that care about targeting, a lot of cards that care about the likelihood of keywords and stuff. There's a lot of opportunity for this thing to shine, even if it does sound like a fairly weak card on its own. The last thing I'll say about Family Reunion before we move on is we have like mentioned Vile Feast like 1,000 times in this video. Like, how do we feel if we look at Family Reunion as Vile Feast, right? It comes down, it kills a 1 health unit, and then it does have all of these other keywords that it can do later on in the game. So it can give impact later on in the game. It can boost later in the game. If we use those, great. If we don't, great. The reason that we are playing Family Reunion was for that 1 point of Gloom for 2 mana. And then everything that else that comes later is just icing on the cake. And that's the place where I think it's really kind of interesting and impactful to me. And so after that, we have the Beefcake Mayor, a 3/4 Yordle for 4 mana. Not that great. It starts with impact, and then at the round start, you boost it. And that's where I think it has the potential to really kind of pop off, is how quickly can you get Spirit onto this thing? And then if you get Spirit on it, will it stick around long enough to be getting both stacks of impact and Spirit turn after turn for the remainder of the game? And that might be enough. It sounds like a lot of work to me, given the context of the cards we've seen up to this point. And while it does seem kind of nice, I'm not quite certain that the payoff is quite enough. And so it definitely needs something else surrounding it to where your cards really care about getting a lot of impact, or they really care about seeing a lot of stacks of Spirit be generated. And at that point, maybe it's kind of like an engine to help level up your Lux. But just like solitarily on its own, having essentially a 4/4 for 4 mana that has the upside potential on future turns, it doesn't really strike me as having enough upside for the future. After that, we have Grim down here at the bottom left, a 6 mana fearsome 5/3 that on play you grant a unit 4 stacks of Gloom. And this is another one. We've seen like tons of these cards throughout the history of Legends of Runeterra. They strike me as things that should be exceptionally powerful, right? Like looking at a game like Magic and looking at games like Hearthstone, these kind of like big mid-rangey style of units that come down and kill something and leave a big body behind afterwards have always been good. And in Legends of Runeterra, they have not. And I don't see Grim really being the kind of thing that pushes the boundaries of how good these kind of cards can be. And it just doesn't strike me as enough on its own. And so I guess to me, the big thing with Grim is it does essentially automatically flip your Vex. But is that even enough? Like, is this thing coming down, flipping Vex and saying, oh boy, we're off to the races now? Like, that just does not strike me as strong enough to do. Even if, Vex is flipped and we're eating down the opposing board and attacking for, 11 damage or so, I'm just having like a hard time convincing myself that this is ever good. And so, to me, if we're playing the Gloom deck and really trying to pop off with Gloom, it might just be a necessity. You might have to play Grim to get enough density of Gloom cards to get the Gloom effects going. But if the only payoff for going really heavy into Gloom is Vex, then I'm not sold on any of that at all. Like, just attacking with Vex isn't really enough Gloom to warrant all of the effort. And so I'm not really interested in any of that. After that, we have Shadow, the old Vex boat, if you will. The 2/5 for 5 mana with Fearsome. When it's summoned, you draw Vex, that's the boat part, and it has +1 attack for each different time you've granted Gloom this game. And so, like, as we talked about this, like, working with Vex, maybe this is just enough, right? If we play Vex on turn 4, and then we play Grim on turn 5, and then we play, or I'm sorry, play Shadow on turn 5, and then play Grim on turn 6, like, that gets us, let's say, the automatic flip on Vex. We'll say that gets us to 6 stacks of Gloom once it's all said and done. Like, I guess that's an attack for lethal, right? You're really hinging a lot of your bets on the back of a 3 health unit, but as we look at these stat lines, I guess like 6 stacks of Gloom and Shadow is 8, and then Vex and Grim is 11. What's 8 plus 11? 19? Look at that. Look at that. Look at me come out here and struggle with these basic mathematics. I'm pretty certain that example was on point at 19, but like, I guess that could be the lethal that you're looking for. A glare would get that up to 20. The Vex flip attack thing with the bonus glare would get you up to 20. Like, that seems like it's enough, but the one of the things I like to evaluate is when it goes right, how right does it go? And that sounds like a win, right? You had to naturally draw your Vex, but Vex on 4, Shadow on 5, Grim on 6 sounds like it's enough to just attack and win the game. But what happens when it goes wrong? You've got a bunch of do-nothing fearsome units on the board. And so I'm not really sold on it. I don't like the idea of being that super all-in on Vex when, like, Grim is the part that's required to make it work. One of the things I'm not certain about with Gloom is what happens if we play Grim on an opposing 1/1. Does it get 4 stacks of Gloom, or does it get like 4 stacks of Gloom and then die, or does it get 1 stack and then just die? I think it should get all 4 at once, right? But as we kind of talked about not being able to draw on Glare, you can cancel the playability on Grim by interacting with that unit. And I feel like if that's what the draw that you're counting on working, your Vex into Shadow into Grim, and then your opponent like recalls out of the playability, then you probably just lost that game as well. And so I'm not super sold on this stuff. I'm not really sold on these abilities. There is some kind of interesting stuff here as to where if you want to play Grim in your Elder Dragon deck, you can do it, but I'm not really buying in on this Gloom as a build-around kind of thing. Last one here, though, Existential Dread. This is the kind of card that I can buy into in terms of actually leveling up Vex, right? And so if we have this curve to where, you know, we play a 2-drop and like nothing on 1, and then we play a 2-drop on 2, and then a 2-drop on 3, so we're banked up to 2 spell mana. And then on turn 4, maybe we Existential Dread and play another unit, and then on turn 5 we play Vex and attack. Like, I can see that kind of thing happening. Or if we take the full 3 mana bank into turn 5, we play Existential Dread and then play Vex. Like, these are things that strike me as very doable, and they don't require a lot to go right. So where we were talking about, you know, I'm playing Grim, he's the linchpin to the entire fearsome attack working, opponent recalls out of it, we're kind of hosed. Existential Dread is just always good. It's going to kill some small units, it's going to weaken the bigger units, it might prevent one unit from blocking a fearsome. Like, it's going to do a lot of work all on its own, and even when things go wrong with Existential Dread, it's still going to be fine. And so that's a card that I expect to see quite a bit of. Whether or not it's in a Vex deck isn't really visible right now. You know, Vex is 100% going to play Existential Dread, but I think there's going to be a lot of Shadow Isles decks out there that are interested in this anyways. It's just going to be an all-around pretty good removal spell. So, interesting stuff. I think that's the end. Oh, there's the Path of Champions stuff up here. I forget we got to talk about those as well. And this was actually something I thought was interesting, and I'm surprised we haven't seen in the space of Standard. And so at the round start, if you have the attack token boost all enemies, fine, whatever, that's going to really ramp up all of the glooms, and your removal spells are going to be strong. And then after that, the one I thought was very interesting is damage to enemies is dealt in the form of gloom. And I'm curious if we'll see a card like this in Standard that just hasn't been revealed yet, to where, you know, some epic card that says when your units deal damage to a unit, it does the damage in the form of gloom. And so it puts a bunch of -1/-1 counters on the opposing units. This would be Wither in the space of Magic. And that's very kind of interesting to me in the space of Standard, because it really lets your smaller units just truck all over some bigger units. And then it's also interesting in Path of Champion because there's some matchups that just can't stop this. And so we'll see how it plays itself out in Path. But that middle ability there, the damage to enemies is dealt in the form of Gloom. I was very interested if that made its way into Standard. What are these cards in here, though? Did they ever show stuff in the Path of Champions thing that hasn't been released yet? What is Grotesque Gift? What is Family Reunion? Like we haven't seen any of these cards, right? Hang on, let me back this up just a hot second. Family Reunion, okay, Grotesque Gift and Family Reunion. Maybe these cards are appearing within the Vex deck. Ally, Ally. I don't know if we've seen it. And Grim sucks. We talk trash about Grim. Ally, Allay. Is that the strike spell? The Demacian strike spell? I don't know what that is. Maybe that's just one we haven't seen yet. But nonetheless, as far as Path of Champions goes, we'll see how this deck is. It listed it as defensive. It strikes me as one of those things that does not scale well. And so as you play against a Sejuani, and Sejuani is just super big and high powered and doubling her attack and health and everything, these abilities don't strike me as too strong, but any go wide strategy, this is going to come out and completely annihilate. And so it feels very swingy to me, but more interested to see if that Wither makes its way into Standard. And so, good stuff. I had fun with that. I hope you did too, because that is going to do it for us today. So if everyone enjoyed the video, hope you learned a thing or two along the way. You had a good time watching. This is Busted Me. Thank you for being here.